Among the president's critics on the sequester, you can count Essie's friend Pete Hegseth, CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. And since he's our guest, that means he must be in the guest spot. That's how it works, Essie.
Yep. Right.
Pete, welcome to the show, and thank you for your service in Iraq and other places. But, sir, I take a little issue with your characterization of what the president is doing in the sequester battle. You say he's sort of playing a blame game. He's making the Republicans seem as if they are being obstructionists, when we know obstruction is an admitted strategy on that side. We know that even John Boehner cannot lead his own caucus, so to say the president isn't leading is a bit strange. And I want to get you to respond to a quote from Tom Cole, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, of course, in the New Yorker, and Ryan Liz's great piece about Eric Cantor. He says, it's a little like a dysfunctional family right now, speaking about the GOP, where everybody knows old Uncle Joe at the end of the table is an alcoholic, but nobody wants to say it. Somebody needs to say it. We need to get Joe some help. Come on, he's ruined too many Christmas parties. I think he's talking about Uncle Joe as the sort of far right, maybe the Tea Party group, the far right, that's sort of bringing the party further and further to the right. Essie has said something similar to this. Will you, sir, be critical of old Uncle Joe?
Well, hey, I think there's plenty of obstruction and plenty of dysfunction to go around. The point I'm trying to make is that Republicans, conservatives, those who believe in getting at our debt and deficit have been painted as just defenders, blind defenders of the rich. And the president has been very shrewd in doing just that and using the fact that they're unwilling to close loopholes against them. And my argument is, call his bluff. You know what? Let's close some loopholes and some corporate loopholes for the rich, and let's reduce the payroll tax rate, which is hitting the middle class. You know, gas is more expensive, wages are going down. That payroll cut did hit, and then let's also ask for some actual tax reform across the board to simplify the code, make it accessible to the little guy. Because I really do think there are some sound, fiscally conservative proposals that flips that script and shows that, hey, those that care about debt and deficit, and veterans care about that too, aren't here to defend the rich. We're here to bring our country to a fiscally solvent place.
Well, and you know, Pete, on the payroll tax cut, it's actually interesting because Republicans were the ones most reluctant to extend the payroll tax cut, and ultimately both sides decided to let that tax cut expire because Democrats were worried about long-term impact also on our fiscal situation and on entitlement programs. But you talk about the president's, quote, middle-class rhetoric, indicating that he doesn't really have policies or plans or isn't really actually helping the middle class. He talked about a number of things in his State of the Union address. He advocated for increasing the minimum wage, universal pre-K, investing in infrastructure, all things that I think would help the middle class and the working class. But I'm interested in knowing what sort of middle class proposals are you looking for from this president?
Well, I do think the problem with the sequester, to bring it, not to just bring it back to that, is that of course it cuts a lot of the discretionary pieces of the budget that are good investments, that do provide equal opportunity. And so in indiscriminately cutting those and being unwilling, completely unwilling to reform entitlements, and he's taken that off the table proactively.
Well,
when you're not willing to talk about it,
in his State of the Union,
you go to the
specifically about reforming entitlements, and has offered several proposals and said anything that he's offered is still on the table, but he wants in exchange for that some willingness to close the loopholes that you yourself have said should be closed.
Well, so the question would be, do you call his bluff and then say, where indeed are your entitlement reforms? Because our budget and our debt and our deficit are ultimately going to fall on the backs of the middle class. There aren't enough taxes you can raise on the wealthy, just like there's not enough defense you can cut. You can cut the whole Defense Department, and that's half of 1 year's annual deficit. You can reform the Defense Department, and that's precisely what our organization thinks we should be doing, finding ways to cut. And that, in doing so, you get away from stripping a lot of these programs in the discretionary side of the budget that people like, and people believe government should be doing. We got to reform it, not cut it. That's why sequestration is so bad.
Well, Pete, I guess I'm struggling to see what you think Obama is really doing wrong when it comes to sequestration. I mean, Obama has said he's looking for a long-term deal here, this grand bargain, which would be half an entitlement reform, and then would also include basically a tax reform, closing tax loopholes, tax deductions, having that discussion about tax reform. He said that would be the other part of it, and he's talked about change CPI, but in the immediate question of sequestration, there is a proposal on the table from Democrats that would, as you say, you're saying call the bluff here, that would close loopholes and deductions, and that would do half spending cuts. And there is no comparable plan from Republicans. So I don't.
Just as, well, that's not true. Just as there are two budgets that have been passed in the House. There are two budgets that have been passed in the House that do similar things.
Okay, I don't mean to interrupt, but that's an important point.
Yeah.
It passed in the last Congress, and by all reasonable estimates, there's no way the Republicans would have the votes to pass pass what they passed in the last Congress in the new Congress. They have not put a plan forward.
No, they've passed 2 plans. The issue is with the rhetoric of this administration, is that they talk about the desire for deficit reduction. And he said in his State of the Union that nothing he was proposing was going to add a single penny to the debt or deficit, which is blatantly untrue. So the rhetoric is there in talking about responsibility, but the reality and the manifestation of that reality, if we close loopholes on the rich, how much is that going to do for our spending problem or to balance our budgets? Virtually nothing.
It couldn't cover half
just
the
like
cost
sequestration
of the...
Of what?
Of the sequester. Couldn't cover half the cost.
Half the cost of the sequester.
If you did deductions and loopholes, you don't think you could cover right now, patch up a year of the sequester with that?
But does that change the trend lines? Just like does the nature of the sequester cuts change trend lines? It doesn't, and we're still going up in the trajectory of the way we spend, adding more and more debt and deficit to the load of our country, which should be concerning to all of us. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors here on both sides, not actually getting to the root of the problem. Hey, close some loopholes. Hey, reform entitlements and come to the table and get it done. So we do agree on more than we think. There's a lot of posturing and politics on both sides.
And let's talk, Pete, quickly about some of the dangerous politics going on. DHS released hundreds of illegal immigrants in advance of the sequester, before the cuts have even taken place. ICE officials reportedly say they plan to release as many as 10,000. There is broad discretion in these various agencies in terms of how to implement these cuts. The political grandstanding that could potentially put American lives in danger, shouldn't these agency heads be fired on the spot for doing that?
Well, they should be held to account for it. I mean, have you gotten your sequestration survival kit yet, S.E.? I mean, everybody should. It's the good old-fashioned Washington Monument strategy being used across the board. Defense is doing it, too. We're not going to send an aircraft carrier to the Middle East because of this. If they wanted to reduce and reform elsewhere, they would. They're trying to make these cuts look scarier than they should be, and that's why we need thoughtful people coming to the table. Our group is saying, hey, there are places we can cut the Defense Department. Let's reform it so that we preserve capabilities, cutting the fat, preserving the muscle. The nature of these cuts is the problem, and then you got irresponsible politicians running around saying that their hair is on fire, when in actuality there's sensible ways to get this done.
But nothing about Uncle Joe, huh, Pete?
Well, hey, I think the whole article was about Uncle Joe in a certain sense.
Everybody loves Uncle Joe.
Oh, everybody does not love Uncle Joe. All right, Pete, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The Senate today is looking